Welcome to Reach, your platform to connect with other executive assistants and acquire game-changing knowledge and perspective. Reach is designed to inspire your workday, guide you through pivotal moments in your career, and transform you into the executive assistant you've always wanted to be. Hello and welcome to another episode of Reach. This is your host, Jessica Vann, founder and CEO of Maven Recruiting Group. And today I am joined with Laurie Woolever. Welcome, Laurie.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. It is an understatement to say that I have been looking forward to this day for several months. I feel like I know, right? I feel like we really manifested this into being because as soon as I saw that you had released your latest book, which is a book we'll talk more about. It's a memoir, but it's called Care and Feeding. And knowing that you have had this phenomenal career that started in the administrative support world and how you have taken it and all of these different kind of iterations and permutations and all the different ways and directions that you've gone, I just knew that your story would be so well received and so inspiring to our audience of executive assistants. And we were just determined to have you on the program. So having you here today is really a very full circle moment, not just for us and me personally as a show, but really to be able to treat our guests to you and to your story. And so I really couldn't thank you enough. I touched on this briefly, but I'll go into a little bit more depth. So Laurie's had really an iconic career that has taken her behind the scenes of the very notorious, seductive world of celebrity chefs and food. She is best known probably as a longtime assistant and trusted collaborator to Anthony Bourdain. But before stepping into that world, you did a bunch of things. You were a receptionist, you were a private chef to an ultra high net worth, very health conscious family, gave you a lot of material and fodder for your future career as a writer. She attended culinary school and graduated from that. She worked for celebrity chef Mario Batali during his heyday. So your career has really evolved from food media and editorial work to really this incredible creative partnership that you had with the late Anthony Bourdain. You authored several books with him. And after his passing, you completed one of the books that you started together, which was World Travel and Irreverent Guide. And then you were also honored with the tremendous weight and responsibility of writing the Definitive Oral Biography of Anthony Bourdain, which became an immediate New York Times bestseller. And your latest book, which I touched on, is called Care and Feeding. This is a memoir of your life so far. I say so far because we are always still at it and doing different things and evolving, hopefully. And you just shared with me that this has also become a New York Times bestseller.
Yes. First week of publication, it hit the bestseller list at number 8 in the nonfiction category.
I mean, wow, Laurie.
Yeah.
2 New York Times bestselling credits to your name is no small feat.
Actually.
3.
Yeah. World Travel hit the list at number 1 in its category when it came out, and it was on the list for a few weeks. So yeah, it's kind of wild to have 3 bestsellers.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I'm excited to get into more about your memoir. I found it laugh out loud, witty, very raw, sometimes cringy, sometimes difficult, hard to listen to, hard to read. I can only imagine what that was like to write at times. Looking forward to getting into all of it. So
Great.
with no further ado, as I mentioned, on this show, we like to tell the often surprising, unexpected stories of executive assistants and personal assistants. And these stories really diverge wildly, right? They can be very, very, very nuanced, very, very, very different depending on who you work for.
Mhm.
And there's some people who do this for their entire career, and there's others like yourself who go on to tackle other passions and other things. So I'd love to understand how you got your start as an assistant and how being an assistant helped shape the career that you have now.
Yeah. I would say that my first assistant job was working as a cook for the ultra high net worth family that you mentioned. Technically, my job was cook, but I was the cooking part of the job really didn't take up the whole day. So I became kind of a household assistant. And this was a family who had a lot of assistants and a lot of different levels of assistants that in some cases bridge the gap between personal and professional obligations. And some people were strictly around the business concerns, and some people were strictly household, and that was my role. So I was doing grocery shopping, keeping things stocked, not only food and things like that, cleaning supplies, but also shirts and undergarments and stockings and all of the stuff that this family just didn't want to have to think about. They just wanted to know that there was always going to be fresh laundry, dry cleaning, everything, the periodicals in the household. It was just entry level assisting, keeping somebody's life in order. And I learned a lot. And I really liked the flexibility and the sort of independence that it gave me. I knew what my responsibilities were, but I wasn't sitting at a desk being micromanaged. I was really on my own to make sure that I was hitting the goals and that the family set out for me. Um, and yeah, I liked that I could do the job with a college degree. I didn't have to go to grad school or law school or medical school, which I wasn't interested in. And
Hmm.
yet I was around a lot of really interesting, smart, engaging people. And I was getting to cook, which is what I really wanted to be doing. Cooking and writing were the two things that I really wanted to do. And then I went to cooking school so that I could really have, good, solid culinary skills. And I took the experience of the first job and I took the education from cooking school and put those together to be Mario Batali's assistant. Um, as much as I wanted to learn to cook, and I'm very glad that I did that, I wasn't crazy about the idea of being a line cook in a restaurant. It is a very difficult job. It is a really demanding job, and it takes a certain amount of intestinal fortitude, which I didn't have at the time. I didn't like not being good at something, and you're just not good when you first start. You're just not. You really have to just learn the craft by doing. And I was kind of impatient with myself, and I was very lucky to come across this opportunity to interview with Mario Batali, who was at the time he had just opened his second restaurant. He had just published his first book. He had been on the TV Food Network for a few years, and he was looking for someone to help him keep it all organized and together. I think his wife had been doing it previously, and they had a few young children, and it was like, you need to find someone to do this job because I got my hands full with the babies. Um, and it was a great fit in a lot of ways. It was really exciting, not always easy, not always pleasant. I think Mario's travails are a matter of public record, and I can, vouch for some
Hmm.
of that. And I wrote about some of that in my book.
Hmm.
But it was, in a lot of ways, a great job and a job that set me up for everything that followed.
Yeah.
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 So, and then there was a number of years where I wasn't an assistant. And then I went back about 10 years after I left working for Mario. I went back and started working for Tony Bourdain. And it was a very different kind of job. He was a very different kind of boss. And, truly the greatest boss I've ever had, and a really an excellent job in a lot of ways for me, a real good fit for my life. And, what an incredible mentor.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get along here. But it's interesting to hear how everything really kind of flowed for you from the initial family, which by the way, I loved that segment of the book. I
Mm.
mean, they that was probably one of the funniest parts of the book for me. talking
Mm,
about you use this line, their flavorless immortality,
yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, it was just so descriptive, and I really felt like I was there with you. So there was, at the same time, kind of some moments of uncertainty in your career, some moments of struggle, some moments of, am I on the right path? Is this what I'm meant to be doing? How am I going to make this work? And really like some very challenging and significant sacrifices that you had to make. I'm thinking about when you had the editorial job and you were commuting something like 5 hours a day. And I mean, just like
Mm-mm.
incredibly laborious, challenging, sacrificial things that you had to do to make this career come together as you have. And I'm curious how some of these experiences shaped your sense of direction and purpose, and if you have any advice for others who feel like they might be lost or a little bit meandering and wondering how to make
Mm.
it all come together, how to manifest the career that they want.
Mm. Yeah, it's really it's funny that you say that it flows. I mean, I feel like my career has been a series of sort of switchbacks and forks in the road and sometimes false turns and big U-turns. But there was a lot of luck involved. I can't discount that. Um, and I think I understood early on that the connections that you make and the recommendations that you're getting from one employer to the next, they really just can't be you can't overestimate how valuable those things are. Um, so I think it's important to make as good an impression as you can on everyone that you encounter, because I mean it's sort of a cliche. The same people that you meet on the way up, you're going to meet on the way down, and you never really know where someone's going to end up. You may all be on one entry level at one time, but I've seen a lot of people that I met in my 20s really ascend to some pretty powerful roles. And if we've maintained a good relationship, if we can help each other professionally, that's been valuable for everyone. My specific area of interest was food media, and it's really changed a lot since I tried, first began trying to be a published writer. I was right at the beginning of the explosion of the internet. I went to high school and college basically without the internet, and it wasn't really in wide use until a few years after I graduated. And I've seen a lot of cycles come and go in the world of food media. There was a time where there were so many jobs and there was so much being produced, and things have really contracted now a lot as the publishers really struggle to figure out a profit model that makes sense. So I think because of that, and because of the way that the world is, that things are so changeable. It just to stay very flexible and keep an open mind about what it is that you have your core passion, but how that gets expressed, how you work that passion, how you are able to make a living at that passion, that may have to change. I come from a generation where there was a lot of derision around selling out, and
Mm,
even the idea of working at a magazine job was sort of considered selling out versus being like a real writer. But
mhm.
we've really had to adjust our definitions of what it means to do good work and what it means to do um, whether selling out is even still a viable concept and what that really means. And I think if you're working with integrity, if you're doing good creative work, it's not as important, who the platform is, or it's good to be honest. You've got to be ethical and fair and a good person. But there's the definition of how creative work gets done, I think, has really changed radically in the last 25 years.
Yeah. Well, and I'm laughing when you say selling out because I mean I also understand that very
Mm,
intimately. And I think like now we're in this model of influencer culture where everything is a sellout by definition, right? And
hmm
it's so interesting. I mean, just these massive societal pendulum shifts.
hmm
And I feel like if anything, we've become more conditioned to selling out and
Yeah.
a lot more apathetic to that whole idea of integrity, which
Yeah.
is it's just interesting, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's, it can be very dangerous. I was just thinking the other day, there's a reality television person who I really admire who has sort of moved into influencing and has a lot of brand deals. And I think she's funny and she's so smart and I love what she has to say. And then I think about how much of the time when I'm listening to her, she's selling something. If
Mhm.
I don't fast forward through the podcast or through the ads in the podcast, it's an Amazon ad read and it's a this ad read and a that ad
Right.
read. And I know, because I'm media savvy and because I'm 51 years old, that A, I don't have to listen to that, and B, she doesn't necessarily shop all the places that she says she shops. She doesn't think every skincare product is life changing. But I do wonder about younger people. I have a teenage son and he's very susceptible to all kinds of,
Mhm.
he's like, I want to get this mouth tape or this tooth whitening pen, all these things he sees
Yeah.
on TikTok. And
Yeah.
we have to, we still have to think about media literacy. I know we're getting a little bit off topic, but this is
Yeah.
what's top of mind for me in this media
Oh,
world.
100%. I'm 100. I mean, I also have a teenager and then a 9-year-old. So
Mm.
yes, they are inundated, to say the
Hmm.
least. I mean, I feel like this memoir spares no one, including yourself, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I think you
Hmm.
are the most exposed of anyone in this memoir.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, can you tell us about your decision and the artistic choice to be as radically frank and forthcoming as you are in this memoir? And then I'm also curious to know what sorts of reactions you've had from those who've been named in the memoir, or those whose lives, are also told and shared.
So the decision to be as honest as I was, I can't imagine doing it any other way. I think that if to undertake something like this and to try and tell a story that's resonant with readers, you have to be honest. I didn't think there was any reason for me to hide the bad decisions I made, the bad behavior, the damage. I mean, it happened. It's real. And it's it's far more interesting, I think, than sort of sugarcoating it and being really vague about things. I mean, I think I tried to, in some cases, be a little discreet, but there's plenty of stuff that's pretty out there. That's pretty, not behavior that I'm not proud of, but I have to own it. I did it, and I'm doing better now. I'm making better decisions. I'm living a better life, but this is part of my story. And these are the kinds of books that I'm much more interested in reading. The memoirs that I've always enjoyed, and especially as I was getting ready to write my own, the ones that really spoke to me were the ones where people were just extremely honest about their flaws and their faults and their doubts and the warts and all of it.
Mhm.
So it seemed the only way to do it was to really lay it all out there. And I did, believe it or not, I did hold some stuff back. I mean, there are stories I didn't tell, and
Mhm.
there might be one story that stands in for 12 or 14 that are similar, for the sake of the narrative. And as far as the feedback from people, I tried to proceed with caution. Mary Carr, who's a brilliant novelist and poet,
Mhm.
and writing teacher, her book, The Art of Memoir, was really, really valuable to read. I read it a couple of times before I started and during the process. There's so many things, the whole craft, all aspects of writing a memoir, but especially the parts about how to proceed thoughtfully and carefully with other people's lives and to decide how to decide what to put in and what to leave out. And some of the basic things that I took away from it are you've got to keep the story focused on yourself. Tell your story from your perspective. This is not about score settling. This is not about trying to make somebody look bad for no reason. um, changing names, changing identifying
Mhm.
details, and then also giving some people an opportunity to read what's been written about them before it goes to print, or at least to give them a heads up, before the book comes out, just let them know what's coming. So I did offer a few people the chance to look at what had been written and just to make sure that we were all in
Mhm.
agreement on the facts and on the and some people did and some people said no thanks, and there were some people who I didn't reach out to, in part because we're not really in each other's lives anymore. And in a lot of cases, the identifying details were obscured. So they may know who they are, but there's, if you didn't know them, you wouldn't know them. Any real angry responses from people. I was very concerned about my father reading it, who's 78 years old. And he ultimately decided that he didn't want to read it. Although he's very
Mm.
supportive, he's bought a number of copies and he's
Mhm.
given away a number of copies, which sort of makes me nervous. He's given some copies to his friends. I'm like, ooh. But I'm just staying out of it. But he thought, well, there's probably a lot that I don't know, that I don't necessarily want to know as a parent.
Yeah.
I was a little concerned about my son, who again is
Mhm.
16, and fortunately, he couldn't be less interested in reading it.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
he's also a teenager.
yeah, he's
So,
a teenager.
yeah.
He's into his own life, and I think
Yep.
it's like he knows enough to know that there are stories in there that he doesn't want to read, and I totally respect that. And I think I've said this a number of times. If my mother was still alive and she
Mhm.
wrote a book about her feelings, I'd be like, no, thank you. I have no interest. So I totally get it. And maybe at some point, he will read it, and then we can talk about it. And then my ex-husband, I was concerned. I had him in mind. I tried to be very thoughtful and intentional in the writing, and really just make it clear that I was telling the story of my feelings, my
Mhm.
bad behavior, how I contributed to the end of our marriage, and did not at all use it as a place to litigate any of his shortcomings, of which there were few. I mean,
Yeah.
I was the jerk. It's very clear. So, and I gave him a chance to look at it ahead of time, and he's we have not discussed it. I don't know
Yeah.
I don't know if he's read it, but he has it if he wants to read it.
Obviously, I don't know you personally, just through
Mhm.
your narrative, but I felt like there was a lot of ownership in how you discussed that, and like you said, I never got the impression that it was a tit for tat, or that you were litigating the relationship in any way. There was a
Mhm.
lot of ownership in that.
Mm, mhm.
So was Mario Batali one of the people that you offered a pre-read to? No.
No, no,
Yeah.
I don't have a relationship with him, and I wasn't certainly not interested in his feedback on it.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure he's aware. I would guess he's aware of it. I don't have any contact with him, but
Yeah.
the publisher gave it a very thorough legal vetting, and
Mhm.
so I felt that as long as they felt confident and stood behind publishing it, that was really all I needed to know about the Mario piece of it.
Yeah. I imagine too, though, there's something very liberating for you in at one time having to be so hyper concerned about his opinion, his acceptance of you, because he really was a catalyst in many ways for introductions and things like that. And,
Mhm.
I think if I'm not mistaken, he helped in recommending you for Tony's support role.
Yeah.
But the liberation comes in being able to stand so firmly in your own independent
Mhm.
identity, as you correctly corrected me about, 3-time New York
Yeah.
New York Times bestselling author, to be so assured in that. And
Mhm.
that's a really liberating moment to not have to kind of endure bad behavior because you're still needing those endorsements or those connections. And, I think that's really wonderful.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I was afraid of him for a really long time, and arguably, I mean, I don't think there's anything he can do to me, but I'm still, I'm not interested in running into him out in the world. I'm
Mhm.
not interested in hearing from him. He was a bully, and he was, sort of not unlike a certain president of the United States in terms of his score settling, and making the professional personal, and blacklisting people, and all of that. So long after I stopped working with him, it was still very important to me that I stay on the right side of him, because I had seen that he was capable of really trying to ruin people's careers. So
Yeah.
once the light was shed on his truly egregious behavior, and once he had consequences for his behavior, I no longer felt that fear.
Right.
So if he were still a viable, entertainer and chef and business owner in the world, I would have written a completely different kind of book.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've had a lot that's happened since the days of you supporting him.
Mhm.
We've had the Me Too movement. We've had a lot of exposure, but I s I sympathize for the women who haven't quite been vindicated in the same way. Like, maybe their
Mm.
boss is not at the level of status or celebrity to where they get that kind of public acknowledgement of the wrongdoing, right? And they just sort of have to
Mhm.
silently endure. And I mean,
Mhm.
this is largely a podcast for executive assistants, and it doesn't take any huge stretch of the imagination to imagine there's a lot of them that have had to tolerate things that are not above
Yeah.
board. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So, how do you know at what point in your life to write a memoir, right? Because as you mentioned, you're 51. How did you know this was the time? Because you could have also said, I'm gonna keep doing this life thing for another 10 years and
Mm.
see
Mhm.
how I feel at 60 or whatever. How did you know, no, this is good. This is the time to tell this part of my life so far.
Yeah, well, the deck was cleared having published World Travel and Bourdain, the Definitive Oral Biography, and I had a great relationship with a publisher. And I had these stories to tell, and I could see that there was kind of a natural arc, 25 years of education and working and life and marriage and divorce and motherhood, all of these things. It really, I could see the whole story laid out, and so I thought, why wait another 10 years? This was the book that I've been wanting to write for a very long time. It's the thing that if I got a terminal diagnosis, I
Mm,
would be very disappointed that I hadn't already started on it. So it just, there was no reason for me not to do it. And I knew I had to at least give it a shot, write a proposal and see if I could sell it to someone. I had one yes. I had a lot of no's from a lot of publishers, but I got, all you need is one yes, and I got that one yes, and they believed in me, and it doesn't hurt that I had stories and I had experiences with two very big names that, that they could write the word Bourdain. The marketing department could decide to do that, to write, the author of Bourdain on the cover of my book. And that is just, that's just true facts, right?
mhm,
And the more time I waited, the less compelling that is as a
mm,
talking point. And
sure.
which sounds very cynical, but it's just true. You really, to get something published, to get a show made, to get whatever it is, that's something that needs funding. You have to demonstrate a platform and demonstrate that these are the people that are going to read it because XYZ. So I'm not naive, to think that if I had two different bosses who were, a guy who owned a gardening store and a school teacher, those would the interest would be different and the
Mhm,
positioning would be different, and maybe I wouldn't get to write and publish that book. So it's a double-edged sword, writing about high profile people. They cast a very long shadow, and as a writer and
mhm.
as a person, I will probably never fully get out from under that shadow, but those shadows have helped me too. So
Yeah, yeah.
complicated.
It is complicated, and at the same time, yes, they're huge, um, main characters in your
Mhm.
story. How can they not be? Um, but having read your memoir, you are very much the main character as well, and this is very
Mhm.
much your story. And I think that what's interesting is seeing how their lives intersect with yours, how they inform, how you guys related, how you collaborated. But at the end of the day, it's very much you. Your
Mhm.
relationship with your mother, your relationship with your ex, like all of the things that you talk about in such depth. So, yeah, but it is, as you said, it's complicated finding your own footing.
Mhm.
Um, so talking about that a little bit more, switching gears, maybe talking a little bit about Tony and what that was like. He was so intuitive, right? At least that's how he appeared to be. So intuitive and really driven by kind of instinct and creativity and kind of inspiration, enthusiasm, things like this. He was very sort of visceral in terms of, it seems, how he led his life. So I'm curious, as an assistant, though, when you're
Mhm.
trying to sort of structure things and have some kind of a regimen, how did you approach that? How did you balance his need for kind of creative freedom and flexibility with also logistical coordination?
Mhm. Well, he was, yeah, I mean, I think his Twitter bio and his Instagram bio said enthusiast. So that's exactly right. He was an enthusiast and he was someone who either was wildly into something or couldn't care less about it. I mean, nothing was halfway with him. But he also was, for 28 years, a professional cook and chef. And that requires a great deal of pragmatism and a great deal of focus and, a real start to finish sense of things. He was very big on lists and really believed in the sort of brigade system and the all of the habits that really make for a great cook or a great chef. Not necessarily this creative ability to make delicious, unusual food, but someone who can look at a prep list, get it done, delegate responsibility, keep an eye on things. So, as much as he was, yes, a creative genius, he really did also impose on himself and those around him some structure, which made it much easier. I mean, this wasn't, you know, a, a a painter or something, someone who's got anyone who's got sort of a no sense of time. I mean, he was very, very big on punctuality. He was very big on being
Mm,
not just on time, but early, sometimes like
mm,
psychotically early. Um, and I think his life was so structured because he was so busy, in some ways by choice, that there wasn't a lot of room for messing up. There wasn't a lot of room for things to get sort of off track because it was like, I'm flying here, I'm there for 10 days, I come back, and then I go out on lecture tour, and then maybe I've got a couple of appointments, and then I'm back out on the road shooting television again. I mean, his days were very, very structured. So that made it easy in some ways. If he had the occasional, where he just was too tired or you just wanted a day off, it was so rare that everyone understood.
mhm.
He commanded this kind of respect from people because he was so singular and so valuable, and I mean that in all aspects, all definitions of the word, that he got a lot of leeway. And also he showed up on time and he did the work and he underpromised and over-delivered. So that gave him a lot of sort of credit in the world with the people who he was answering to. And there weren't that many people he was answering to. It was a couple of network executives, his producing partners, his family. He was very much in charge of things. I mean, I really envied that. And I talked about that in the book too, that there were parts of me that wanted to be Tony because of that,
Mhm.
the tremendous amount of freedom that he had. So yeah, he didn't really present a lot of challenges in that way, where he was, he decided to go off schedule and go do something crazy.
Yeah. How did your role, this really wonderful kind of working collaboration that you guys had? I don't
Mhm.
think it's common by any means that somebody starts as an assistant to somebody and then ends up publishing and collaborating with them in this very creative way. Granted, as you mentioned, you had been an assistant, then you'd gone on to do editorial work, you'd always been a writer, you were
Mhm.
always, you were always published. But nevertheless, this this partnership really did evolve to that more of that collaboration and intellectual collaboration. How did that come to be? Did he always sort of see you in that way, or did he kind of grow to see the value of you in that way?
Mm. Well, the first thing we ever did together was back in 2002. He did his first cookbook called Anthony Bourdain's Leal Cookbook, and he was looking to hire someone to do recipe editing and testing. And that's when Mario introduced us. And I think he was impressed with the work I did for that. So I first knew him as an editor and as a not a equal collaborator, but someone that was collaborating with him on a creative project. So I think that really helped me to distinguish myself. I wasn't an admin first. I was a writer and editor first in his eyes. As a fellow writer, I think he also understood that, yeah, writers have to have other jobs, unless they're extraordinarily wealthy or lucky.
Right.
So I think there was a lot of understanding and empathy there. And I needed it when I approached him about working as his assistant. I mean, I approached him just saying, I need a job. I need a part-time job or a flexible job. And he suggested, well, my assistant's leaving. Would you like to maybe do that? Um, so that's how he knew me already, as someone who was leaving an editorial job because of my life circumstances. I had a young baby and it was just not really working for me to work full time. So that's how it started. And then because I was good at the admin side of things, and I really I improved his life. I made his life easy. I kept him from having to answer a million emails and do all the things that an assistant does. I think he saw the value in that, and he was really savvy about continuing to offer me extra work or extra projects that would sort of scratch that creative itch. So it went from doing some line editing on some of the books that he published on his imprint to then eventually co-authoring a cookbook in 2016. And it was generous and he didn't have to do it. It also really solved the problem for him. He had a certain number of books he was obligated to publish with his publisher, and he didn't have a lot of time. And it's like, well, here's a way to publish a book, but I don't have to sit down and write it. And Laurie gets to have this experience. And I got paid above my, what my salary was for the job. And it just worked out for everyone. So, but he was, I heard this later from his agent, who is now also my agent, that he was very aware of making sure that he was giving me creative opportunities that would make me stay,
Mm.
and continue to do the cars and the flights and the doctor's appointments and all that stuff.
That was the perk, one of the
Mm,
perks. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know that's not always the path. I think, executive assistant to me is something different and something really like I'm not sure that I would be, I don't know that I'm detail oriented enough to be like a really successful executive assistant. And I'm
Mm.
guessing that probably I mean, that is like a profession, right? And so there's probably less depending on the sector of business that you're in, that where you're supporting an executive, there may not be as many kinds of collaborative opportunities, but I bet there are. I think,
Mhm.
I mean, maybe someone starts as an EA and then gets, if it's banking, I don't know. I mean,
Right.
I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but yeah, I worked as an assistant so that I could pay the bills and so that I could be close to these fields that were attractive to me.
Right. And I think that's a very good takeaway though, is that, if you are looking to do something more, then you've got to find the industry, the employer, the whatever, where your external or additional, capabilities might find a home. And
Mhm.
clearly you had this huge passion for food and for food writing and all of these things. So it made a perfect sense that you would sort of nest in that world and find your opportunity. But I think
Mhm.
it's important that you have to look for those opportunities in whatever industry that you're in.
Mhm.
Um, and there definitely are a lot of assistants that come to us with that sort of mandate of how do I take on more? How do I do this? And I think it
Mhm.
starts with also having like you know, finding your inroad. And
Mhm.
maybe it's the
Mhm.
industry that you select or it's the type of company that you go to work for, but you've got to find something that there's a logical way to contribute.
Mhm.
So Tony was really respected for his literary voice and style, obviously. He like you said,
Mhm.
he was and I think you even said this, that he defined himself more as a writer first and a chef secondarily.
Mhm.
So how did working for him in such close collaboration, how did it shape your own literary voice and expression, if at all? I mean, maybe it didn't,
Mhm.
but I'm
Mhm.
curious if it had an impact.
Yeah, I think that I had a strong voice as a writer for a long time, and I don't say that with any measure of bragging because there were plenty of things that I didn't have as a writer from a young age. You know, I really had to work at it, had developed the craft. I had to be kind of bad at it for a long time before I got better at it. But I do think that from, you know, teenage years, I had a distinctive voice. And I think I've refined it and I've honed it, but it is what it is. And so I don't know that Tony had a huge impact on that, but I definitely he was one of very few people who I wanted to impress. And
Mm.
so when I was in a position to write something, whether it was, you know, with him or on my own, but that I knew he would see it, I would keep him in mind. And I think a lot of writers do that. You know, you think of your not a huge undifferentiated audience, but one or two very specific people who you look up to and you want to impress them. So he motivated me in that way because, you know, I put a lot of writing out into the world when I was working for him, and I think he saw a lot of it just through social media, and he didn't always say, oh, that was great, you know, but I knew that when he did, he really meant it. And so I
Mhm.
would think about, well, what did I do in that piece and what can I do more of, because
Mm.
I want his approval. And I think I got pretty good at being able to at least do a reasonable facsimile of his voice. There were times, for instance, in writing the cookbook, I was not only, you know, writing out the recipes in a very regimented way, but also writing scratch head notes just to fill the space in, just so we could see how it looked, and then would hand it off to him. And so there were, you know, around 100 recipes, and I wrote all the head notes, you know, with the understanding that he might hate all of these, or he might sort of like some of them, or, you know, I don't really know what's going to happen. And it was really interesting, you know, because I really did try my best to sound like him and to hit different notes and beats that I knew that he would, and make them all kind of different from each other. And there were some that he was like, no, and completely rewrote. And there were some that he kind of made adjustments to, and there were some that he completely left alone. And they were, you know, they felt resonant to
Authentic.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a good skill to develop over the years of, you know, spending time in daily correspondence with him on email, and, you know,
Mhm.
being deeply familiar with everything that he was writing, and the voice of, you know, the things that he would say on television, which I didn't have any role in his television production, but of course I was deeply aware of it and deeply sort of, you know, helping just from a logistical standpoint, as far as he was concerned. You know, all of that, everything he would say on voiceover was he was writing that too. So there's always a lot of new writing coming out of him that I could really just absorb and look at how he was using
Yeah.
language.
Yeah, which is an assistant skill, by the way. I mean, a lot of assistants are having to mimic, ghostwrite, speak as if using the voice
Mm.
of their executive and picking up on
Mhm.
those nuances. So there's a huge amount of intuition that goes into that. I'm curious, what do you think his response would have been to just this crazy proliferation and use of ChatGPT in the writing world? I mean, you and I could go on ChatGPT and we could say, "Hey, write me this head note in the style and voice of Anthony Bourdain," and
Mhm.
ChatGPT would for sure be able to spit out something. What do you think his response to that would be?
I don't know. My gut says that he would hate it. But you know, there were so many times where he would surprise me with his take on things. You know, I would sort of take a very, I would just assume that he would have this or that reaction to something that, you know, because that was kind of the party line or the place where he might normally identify with things. Well, they don't like it, so he's not going to like it. And sometimes I was wrong. Um, I would hope and I would guess, as a writer and as someone who really cared deeply about literature and written expression, that he would find it abhorrent, and that he
Mhm.
would just sort of see it as, you know, the end of the world. But I don't know. You know, he also had a great sense of humor, and so I think maybe not Chat GPT in particular, but other aspects of AI that, you know, that are sort of inadvertently hilarious, but are still hilarious. You know, just the big mistakes or the weird, you know, images where people have six fingers, or, you know, it's the Pope in a Balenciaga coat or whatever it is. Like, I can imagine he would find some of that really funny, because it is really funny.
Mhm.
But yeah, I've never thought about that. That is a really good question. I'm sure he would have opinions.
Oh, I have no doubt. Yeah. Obviously, I don't know him, but
Mhm.
he was someone who was so informed, like, who was informed, who experienced life in this very kind of tactile way, right? He
Mhm, mhm,
lived it. It pulsated through him. The images, the grittiness, the lights, the hangovers, like, all of it, right? Like,
mhm,
the intensity, the bustle. I feel that he, more than anyone I can really think of, like, really appreciated authenticity and appreciated how those authentic interactions and experiences and those sensory experiences inform your experience and how you show up and how you absorb and how that creates a deep resonance and appreciation in your life. And for
mhm,
me, like to take that and have AI parse
mm,
a life of sensory experience and overload and appreciation and the word you said, enthusiast, right?
mhm,
There's no
mhm.
enthusiasm, there's no authentic enthusiasm in
Yeah.
ChatGPT, and so it's so fascinating to me, like, to think about how that gets redacted and what does that mean for just authenticity in general? Like, I think and now we're kind of going back to what we're talking about the influencers and all that other kind of stuff.
Mhm.
It's like ultimate sellout, like that where there's just
Yeah.
no I get the convenience, don't get me wrong, I get the
Mhm.
convenience, but that selloutness, like, that's a hard
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I can imagine that he would really be adamant about not letting anyone use it for any projects that he's associated with.
Mhm.
Really continuing to do things the way that they ought to be done. I'm thinking of I was on a podcast recently, and then I saw, and then it went up, and I was looking at the show notes, and I was like, what? Like it was so clear to me that the show notes had been written by AI because they were 75% right, but then there was some, like,
Mm.
egregiously wrong stuff, and so I think, like, that kind of thing where I mean, he really wanted everyone around him to put in their absolute best effort and really show up and do good work and pay attention and care as much as he did. So the
Yeah.
idea of someone using ChatGPT to summarize a scene or, there was a lot of research that went into every one of the episodes of his show, and the idea of some PA handing him a stack of research that had been generated by Chat GPT. I mean, that I would imagine that would be like an instant firing offense. I would hope,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. I see that too. Um, there was a moment in Care and Feeding where you talk about being one of the I wanna get the quote right,
Mhm,
being one of the unknown women who prop up the work of important men. And I think it
mhm,
was in the context of a television appearance that you guys
mhm.
were gonna be doing, and you were maybe gonna join the television appearance, but then they said, "No, no, no," because you didn't have a reel or something like this, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, can you unpack a little bit what you mean by that and maybe some of the instances that contributed to that feeling? And I guess,
Mhm,
like, I'm also wondering, like, what do you think it is about what's so often misunderstood about the women and men who do support work, who do this very
mm,
important, vital work behind the scenes?
mhm. Yeah, I mean, that scene in particular in that instance, I just wanna say, thank God nobody let me on television at that it was, like, live, it was a national morning show, live television, like, I was completely delusional that I was qualified, and they were right to say, "Sorry, this isn't for you." And once we got there, I was like, "Oh my god, thank God I'm not doing this," this is, like, really high pressure and
Yeah.
just dazzling in a disorienting way. But yeah, it I did have a lot of kind of resentment over the years. I would meet other assistants that were sort of the women. It was often, very often, the women behind men,
Mhm.
and I don't think that's an accident. I think that there is just a working relationship it's a model that worked for this guy, and so well, that's a good idea. I'll hire a woman too. Or there are more women that are willing to do that kind of work where there's some combination of soft skills and hard skills and a flexibility and a real premium on intuitive communication. And I mean, these are, you know, these are huge generalizations about gender. And it's not to say that men can't be or do all those things, or that every woman is great at those things, because neither of those things are true. But
Sure.
in a general sense, these are jobs that I think women are particularly well suited for. And the people who are getting the big contracts and the big TV shows and all of the opportunities to be a very public facing person, well, it's not all men, but it's there are a lot of men. Men I think still outnumber women in those kinds of roles where they both need and can afford an assistant, a full time, at least one full time person behind the scenes. So there's something to be examined there, I think, and just the uneven nature of things. It's a power dynamic. It's a financial reality. Um, I think I did come to understand and appreciate over the years that yes, you know, Tony got all the fame and the glory and the payout and the, you know, everything that comes along with being the front facing person on a television show. Um, he also arguably, you know, had the most to lose. And, you know, it was his face and his name on every single one of these shows and in pretty much every scene. And if, you know, somebody, if they get Emmy nominations and Peabody Awards, which they did, then the glory is on him. But if somebody's unhappy with something, and if somebody, if it doesn't go well, then that's on him too. And I think I didn't always realize that in the moment, that there is, you know, big risk and big reward. And it was, you know, incredibly exhausting. You know, there were 3 or 4 different sort of core crews of producers and directors and cameramen that would go out on shoots, and they would get to come back and recover and work on the edit, but he was right back
He
out.
didn't.
You know, he
Yeah.
didn't get that sort of downtime. So that's one side of it. But the other side is, yeah, just spending a lot of time around assistants and cooks and producers and directors and all of these people, men and women, who really work so hard on whatever the creative endeavor is. I mean, I'm thinking mostly of television, but it's also in publishing, where you feel this sense of ownership and you know that it couldn't have happened without your part in it, but you're not, the public isn't interested, you know, and the public can't, and I don't think the onus should be on the public to be interested in the deep story of every single person that runs in the credits at the end of a show. But there's a kind of melancholy, and there's always going to be that sense of like, you know, this is my show, and I did that, and I spent the hours, and I did all the things, and the only thing anyone ever talks about is the host, the star.
Hmm.
That's the nature of, I mean, that's show business, baby, right?
Hmm.
So, and not everyone can be the star, and not everyone should be the star, but it can be a hard thing to swallow. And especially when you see, you know, especially with men, and especially with chefs, and especially, you know, on television or whatever chefs do to get this sort of celebrity status, it is mostly women, and women doing a lot more work than the word assistant would even apply, you know,
Mm.
ghost writing whole books, cleaning up PR disasters, you know, handling private family matters. Just, I mean, the audience knows, as assistants, we know that how much that word assistant, how much weight that carries.
Yeah. It's wildly misunderstood and wildly, I think, often underappreciated.
Mhm.
And just like you say, how many hyphenations can be in that title
Mhm.
is really quite wild. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was just watching that new film Mountainhead the other night, and I just
Mm.
it's about 4 ultra wealthy guys, and there's a scene where there's an assistant kind of tending to various house, you know, things, getting ready for the guests to come, and it was like, you know. And then I started watching, there's another series called Sirens, and it centers
Mhm.
on a very
Mhm.
busy executive assistant. And again, it was just like, I don't know if I could watch this. It's feeling,
Yeah.
give me a little PTSD.
Yeah. A little
So
too real. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious about, it's interesting. Like when I look at Mario Batali, when I look at Tony Bourdain, I mean, they're like these hyper successful, hyper admired, individuals. Um, and yet they're both like deeply complicated and fallible and not on a pedestal in some ways, and yet very much not on a pedestal in other ways. And
Mm,
I guess I'm curious, like, what that experience has taught you about in terms of success, in terms of fallibility, in terms of, you know, something that Tony talked a lot about imposter syndrome, like kind of this sort of extreme duality of being on the one hand the most of something and
mhm,
admired in every single facet, and then also knowing that there was this deep kind of insecurity and fallibility to both of these men in different ways. They were fallible in different ways, but
mhm.
I'm curious, like, what's your response to that in terms of like having known them in such an intimate, deep way, and just beginning to understand how complex they were, and what
Mm.
did that mean in terms of just how you related to them and how they navigated the world?
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, the short answer is they were both human beings, regular, normal human beings like everyone else who happened to have extraordinary talents in specific areas. And it was the right combination of opportunity and luck and hard work and connections and talent and perseverance, all those things that they became, giants in their field, right? But that didn't mean that just because they had this specific talent and they got to a specific place, that doesn't at all change or cure whatever just the normal human faults and fallibilities that we all have, right? And probably arguably it gave them less reason to work on those things or examine or even really be
Mm.
aware or acknowledge those things, right? Because it's like, well, look at me, I've got all this great success, and why do
I've
I
made
need,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't need to go to therapy, I don't need to treat people any different, or I don't need to treat myself any differently, like I'm the king of the world. um so I think that's one way to look at it. And yeah, there's a part of me that thinks, well, everyone's complicated. Everyone is really, a complex, unique individual, but we don't get to know those people, most of them in our lives. But I think about, what if my father had some crazy success and he was famous? He would still have his demons and his faults and his, full personality. So I think, and I address this a little bit in the forward to the book, that the problems can come in when you have access to everything, when you think that, anything that you want in life if you can use your sheer force of will and or your enormous resources to make it happen. And there are fewer and fewer people around you saying no, because
Mhm.
you've self-selected and you've figured out, or it's just you have that much power that people are just not saying no, and everything is available to you. And there's, inevitably there's an Icarus effect. I think. I mean, I'm sure there are people, I guess, who have managed to avoid that. But I mean, look at some of the biggest, most powerful people in our world currently. Some of them not doing that great. Or maybe they seem like they are, but kind of what's going on behind the scenes. I mean, we all, what is it like? We all put our pants on one leg at a time. We all have functioning bodies, and they're going to break down at some point. And yeah, I think it's just easy to get when you're that level of success and you have that level, that amount of resources. I think it's very easy
Yeah.
to ignore that we are all fallible human beings.
Mhm. Mhm. That's such an intelligent and interesting perspective about that they arguably have less reason to self-reflect. They're getting all this external validation. I think that the more you go through life, the older you get, the more life kind of cycles you get, the more you see just how deeply flawed and challenged and unhealed so many people are. And,
Mhm.
you go about it, you do the best you can, but there's just a lot of unhealedness, and
Yeah.
success doesn't really mask it. It might give you other things, but
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
doesn't really mask the work of healing and,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think when I was in my 20s and working for Mario, I was less aware of that. I was just like, this guy, look at all that he's got, and
sure.
he's can be sometimes mean and scary, sometimes funny and charismatic and fun, but I I I wasn't able as much to see that he was a, a complex human being who had insecurities and
Yeah.
faults and damage. And I saw it more with Tony. I was more aware of it. I had more therapy of my own. And, I
Mhm.
think having a child made me a little more empathetic, but I really don't, I think unfortunately, I think it did take his death to really, for me to sort of really deeply reflect on who he was and how he was living. Just, it's I wish that there were some way. I wish there were a way to for us to really know people and to be more empathetic without having to lose them. But that wasn't the
Yeah.
circumstance.
Yeah. Did you feel like the last few months of his life were not really like he was not really like himself?
No, the last time I saw him in person, he was great and happy and completely in line with the way that I had known him for years. I had a still do. I have a podcast, and he was the executive producer of it, which was a hugely generous thing for him to do. All it really meant was that we put his name on our show notes, and he came in a few times, and we would interview him, and then we would use those conversations in the podcast. So that was the last time I saw him, as he came in and recorded a conversation with me and my partner, and he was in a great mood. And he had just gotten some weird little injury from jujitsu. So he was talking about that very animatedly. And he was on his way to Florence to shoot an episode of television. And
Mhm.
he was, as happy as I've ever seen him. And
Yeah.
and also seemed stable and normal and fine.
Yeah.
Not manic, not depressed, just
Himself.
great, just
Yeah.
himself. Yeah. And I was in touch with him when he was in Florence, and helping him out with this and that. And yeah, no, it wasn't until the last few days where, I knew something was and there, the trouble he was having in his relationship was in the tabloids. So it was a
Mhm.
matter of public record. And I had checked in with him about it. But even then it was like, yeah, let me know if you see anything else in any of the tabloids. And next week I'm going to go to the dentist, and I'm going to get a haircut, and I've got
Mm.
lunch. It was like looking toward the immediate future. And, I said, it's in the book. I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, I'll live, and
Mhm.
we'll survive," meaning he and his girlfriend and their
Mhm.
relationship. And that was the last thing he ever said to me.
Wow.
So I knew from talking to people that were with him in France that he was unhappy, and that he was fighting with his girlfriend, and that he was, up and down and not having a great time, about what was going on in his relationship. But I don't there was no indication to me that it was that he was at the level that he would take his own life.
Right. Right. I mean, clearly,
Yeah.
if there had been an indication,
Yeah,
things
yeah,
would have possibly unfolded differently. So,
yeah.
as we close out here, maybe some parting words of advice for our audience. I mean, you mentioned that it's still this sort of ongoing negotiation, you having this career that is independent and outside of the shadows of these behemoth people that you've worked for, right? And it's sort of
Mhm,
this delicate dance that you're still figuring out, right? But
mhm.
I'm curious if there's any advice that you could share to our audience if they're maybe looking to do something similar of how do you craft an identity outside of the realm of a very significant
Mm,
CEO, boss, leader, founder, whatever it might be.
mhm.
On the one hand, part of you is trading on that cachet, right? And that's sort of what's gotten you to parts of this life that you have. But how do you begin to negotiate that?
Well, life is long, right? So I feel like, for me, okay, I've written this book, and now I'm 51, and I, presumably have a couple of decades left, and so I feel free in a way to start to pursue other things that are interesting to me outside the realm of these celebrities. I've said all that I have to say about that life, I think.
Mhm.
So I guess it's maybe just approaching things with a long-term vision, And also being very clear about what kinds of benefits you're getting from the association with a high net worth or high profile person. I would imagine that most people that are hiring, executive assistants have a real desire for privacy, right? I mean, I did not come from a world of NDAs, but I'm thinking that this is probably much more standard than not, right? So I think there's valuable value in, if you have creative aspirations, that it is something completely divorced from the work that you do as an executive assistant. And, I guess the challenge there is to figure out how to manage your time. I know these jobs are very demanding, and that at the end of the day, maybe you don't really feel like you want to go paint for 4 hours or write a novel. But novels aren't written in a day. I mean, novels are written a word at a time. So or whatever it is, poetry or music. Trying to really regiment enough time and space in your day for the creative can really nourish you. Or looking at it as well, I'm just going to really focus on my job for 5 years, and then save my money financially, figure out how to then stop and devote it to the creative process. I mean, I think everyone's got to kind of, figure out what is, ask yourself, what is the thing that you will regret not doing? Again, if you were to, I mean, so sort of dark to think of a fatal diagnosis, but if some doctor says you've got 6 months to live, what is the thing that you're going to really wish that you had done? Or what is the thing that you're going to scramble to do creatively or professionally with the time that you have left, and figure out how to do that.
What would you like people to know about the reality of building a career as a writer?
It is financially foolish. It's it is, having 3 New York Times bestsellers sounds great, but I worry about money all the time, and I happen to
Mm,
live in I live in New York. I have a
mhm.
child, I mean, this is my choice to live in New York. I could live someplace, but I live in a cheap part of New York. I'm not
Yeah.
paying those like Gossip Girl rents, but yeah, I do it because I love it, and I feel like this is the life that I wanted for myself, but I'm not, it's worth it for me, but it is not a slam dunk.
Yeah.
So I do have to continue to, you know, s- put together different projects, do a couple projects at once. I do some consulting for a podcast that's supported by a big grant. And so
Yeah.
it's not, none of it is a slam dunk, which
Yeah.
I am learning now. It's like, yeah, it doesn't matter, man. If your book's a bestseller, you still got to
Yeah.
pay for rent.
So I have a question. How does it work like when your book is available on Spotify to download? Do
Mhm.
you get a piece of that for every download?
So that's a good question. And I asked my publisher the same thing because I have felt very guilty about, before I knew how it worked, I felt really guilty about downloading books on Spotify, audiobooks on Spotify, because
Right.
I thought that the author or the publisher were not benefiting at all. And it turns out, she didn't go into too much detail, but she said, no, it all adds to the common good. I thought, well, it's much more
Fabulous.
valuable to
Right.
get the book on Audible and then Spotify. And she said it doesn't really work that way. And I don't really know exactly how it works, but I felt better uh, about getting, a book on Spotify versus Audible or another platform.
Okay, good. That's good to
Yeah.
know that the actual content creator, yourself in this case,
Yeah. I mean, I'm not
it's
getting
all
a
part of the model.
individual, yeah, I'm not getting
Sure.
individual checks, but, I assume
No,
that it
right.
all counts toward my advance.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. Okay. Great. Yeah, I have a friend who is a very big name in the food world. Well, in
Mhm.
the sourdough baking community, let me say that.
Okay.
And it's and similar to yourself, like, all the accolades and choosing that life is a choice.
Yeah.
And it's difficult and it's a lot of freelancing and it's a lot of figuring out how you're going to monetize and workshops and hustling here and flying over here to do this project and whatever. I mean, it
Mhm.
seems it's very piecemeal. And on the
Yeah.
one hand, you have all these accolades and honors, but you're constantly on the hustle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's not
Yeah.
my natural state. I mean, I love to just sit back and collect a paycheck. But I also didn't, the times when I was
Yeah.
working a regular 40-hour-a-week job, I felt like I was in a prison. I
Right.
mean, that's vastly overstating it, but I didn't love it. I didn't love that amount of structure.
Yeah.
So,
It wasn't you.
um, yeah.
Mhm.
Speaking gigs, I will say speaking gigs are a big part of it too. So if anyone's in a position to hire a speaker, if you've liked what you've heard, I definitely am a speaker for hire. And that's
Great.
a big part of the business as well.
Great. Love that. Love that. Final question. If you could go back and have one meal or moment with Tony
Mm.
during maybe one of your travels or maybe not, maybe
Hmm.
just hanging out in the apartment,
Hmm.
what moment would you revisit and why?
So in 2016, we were in Los Angeles together for a couple of days, doing a photo shoot for People magazine before the cookbook came out. And then he was sticking around for the Emmys and then shooting an episode in Los Angeles. And he was really happy. We were both staying at the Chateau Marmont, which was like the
Ah,
coolest thing in the
my
world.
friend's favorite hotel.
Yeah. And we went out and he had rented this like ridiculous muscle car and he like wasn't a great driver, but he was so happy driving it. So we, bought him out at the steep base, the steep driveway at the Chateau Marmont, and we just drive a few blocks up Sunset Boulevard to a restaurant called Night Market. And it was my first time there, and it was just so good. And they knew he was there. They sent out the whole menu, and
Mhm.
everything was so delicious and spicy. And he was so happy, and it was just a really magical experience. I would love to do that again. I have a photo of him from that night because he was going to be doing a magazine feature, and they wanted like a candid photo of him eating. So I
Yeah.
took this picture that it was such a nice memory. We had a great time. And yeah, I would love to go back and do that again.
Yeah. Those are the moments.
Hmm.
Simple
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
wonderful.
Hmm.
So, Laurie, tell our listeners how can they support you? What's the best way? You mentioned you do speaking engagements. How can they
Yes.
contact you? How can they support your writing, your work, all the things?
Great. Well, I love when people pay full retail for my book.
Which
um,
means what? Does that mean going on Amazon and buying it, going to
yeah,
your
just
bookstore?
any bookseller. I mean, I'm not, books are available everywhere, but yeah, I love independent bookstores, but I'm not going to, tell people not to shop online or try and get a good price because, books are expensive. But yeah, buy my book. I'm represented by an agent at CAA for speaking. His name is Billy Halleck. And I'm on Instagram, and my DMs are not exactly open, but I do look at DMs that come from people that I'm not following. And so if, and sometimes the greatest opportunities come through my DMs. I just got asked to do a Australian book festival in my DMs. So
Oh,
I get it. This is the world that we live in. So I'm on Instagram at Laurie Woolever, and I try and keep it funny and fun there, and put up a lot of weird stuff. And it's because I
you're
enjoy it.
very funny. Your writing, I laughed out loud so many times reading your
Oh,
book. Yeah,
thank
you're
you.
very funny.
I'm also a funny speaker. And I do have a podcast called Carb Face for Radio, and it's really silly. And we talk about food and the food business and what we're eating and what makes us mad, and it's just fun. So it's not for everyone, but it does have we have tens of listeners.
Yeah, great. Carb face. All right. Well, we'll
Carb
make sure
Face.
to link all of those in our show notes. But
Great.
thank you so much, Laurie. I
Absolutely.
really, really, really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for being so forthcoming and honest and sharing all of it in such an open and heartfelt way. And really admire your career and really appreciate your generosity in joining us today.
Oh, well, thank you very much. This was really fun.
Was it more fun than Joe Rogan?
Yes, I'm much more relaxed.
I have to
I
say, I was disappointed that Joe didn't know what pho was. I was like, "Come on, dude.
know.
Pho."
Yeah. Maybe he just had only ever heard it called faux, and so he was confused. I don't know.
Yeah.
I was thrilled to go on his show.
Of
Because it's like
course.
what a platform.
It's the biggest one in the world. I
Yeah,
mean, come
yeah.
on. Yeah.
My son's baseball coach is like crazy impressed. I feel like he probably like gave my son extra attention as a coach because his mom was on Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would love to go back, but he was less interested in me this time. So too much girl stuff in this book, I think.
Yeah. 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 That's fair.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was a pleasure. Thank you so
Yes.
much. Reach is brought to you by Maven Recruiting Group, who specializes in placing executive assistants and support staff to the Bay Area's most prominent executives and companies. If you've enjoyed being part of our podcast community and are interested in becoming part of our candidate community, we're currently hiring for roles in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Los Angeles. You can visit us at www.mavenrec.com to see some of the roles we're currently working on and to submit your resume.